My name is Ghostboy259 and I recently experienced It Comes in Waves. The last several months on Twitter have been a nightmare for all involved, to say the least, the most prominent feature besides verification badges being this For You page that gives you tons of tweets you didn't ask for. However, as I follow game developers and studios and people who cover such games, I started getting tons of indie developers on that page and started bookmarking games that caught my eye. And the first one that caught my eye immediately was by Antonio Frere, the name behind Merlino Games, and I hope I am pronouncing both of those correctly. Like many others who saw this, the first thing I immediately thought of was Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, walking around the sand dunes of Tatooine. The game was described as a minimalist experimental open-world adventure about guilt and grief. That, and knowing the game was less than an hour long, was enough for me. I was going to play this, and within a couple months I waited for a release and bought it the day it came out. As per usual, I always recommend that you play the game yourself before watching this video because this will contain spoilers, but if you're unable to play the game on your own, or maybe you want to experience it with me, my gaming channel has the highlights and the full VOD of me playing through the game, and it's not very long because the game is not very long, so feel free to check that out. Links are in the description or head to realityescape.ca. The first screen we see when booting up the game is letting us know that there is no saving in the game. If you die, you have to start over. At first, I thought maybe this was a bit of a gimmick, but now in hindsight, knowing how short the game was and how it plays, I think this was a really smart decision, and it kind of plays into the theme, which we'll dive into later. We start the game off with our black-robed figure next to our transport. The transport tells us that we'll never be able to come back to the town after we leave, so we decide to walk around and chat with everyone. There's no buying items or money or transactions or inventory system, but we can still speak to the people, and everyone who speaks to us is immediately hostile, wanting absolutely nothing to do with us. Some are angry, refusing to sell us things, telling us that we're not wanted, others telling us to forgive ourselves or that we can never fix what we've done. Everyone is incredibly vague and cryptic, and these kids say Echuta to me, which I initially had no idea what it meant, but later realized it was a Star Wars reference, supposedly meaning something incredibly rude that cannot be said, which is cute. As we're walking around, we begin to hit nighttime, which falls very quickly in this world, but only for a brief amount of time, and it gives everything a really dark and creepy vibe, and mixed with the soundtrack, it creates a really great and melancholy atmosphere, which I really enjoyed. I didn't personally get Slender Man vibes from it, but for some reason quite a few people in my chat did, but either way, it made everything look super cool. It really makes the sky stand out when that happens, and it only happens a few times. After we take our transport to the wilderness, we find ourselves in a large open desert with some signs to give us some early advice. On our back, we are carrying a specimen, and our goal is to bring it to the sanctuary. Obviously Death Stranding vibes, although I say that without ever having played Death Stranding myself, so perhaps that's a very surface level observation. Those who travel to the sanctuary must be repentant, meaning regretful or remorseful, and the gates will only open for us once our specimen is fully grown. And the game also brings our attention to the water meter at the top left of the screen. We have thirst in this game, and our water levels will deplete, and if we are completely dehydrated, then we'll start to take damage and die. Alternatively, if we take damage, our water will heal us, but that will of course bring us closer to dehydration. The signs teach us about how to use our map, how to draw our weapon and shoot, and reminds us that death is permanent. The last sign simply says, "Don't touch the blood," and with that, we're off into the large open desert, our water already depleting fast just from reading these signs. Off in the distance, we can see several small objects, including people and water canisters. People also have water with them, and by killing people you see, you can collect water from them to replenish your own. You can also find water efficiency improvements, meaning your water levels won't go down as fast, and these will become pretty crucial. Throughout the game, you'll encounter groups of people often shooting at one person trying to run away. We later learn that these are called drought raiders, and while no one is necessary to kill, sometimes you'll have to replenish your water, and sometimes they will shoot at you first. I don't think there's necessarily a benefit to playing passive versus aggressive, except for how that makes you feel in the game. There's also these little droids floating around, but there doesn't seem to be any way to meaningfully interact with them. You can shoot them to no consequence, but also no gain. Shooting is very basic, simply hold down the right mouse button to aim and left click to shoot. There is no ammo, but rather an overheat system similar to the first Mass Effect game. And there are a few guns throughout the game that you can collect that increase damage or fire rate or even the color of your laser. We come across our first little settlement and are fired on immediately, so we return fire and begin to clear the camp out. We take a few hits, our water supply making up for the lost HP, and we find a better gun, many tanks of water, and a 10% specimen growth, which will make our specimen grow faster. In theory, we don't necessarily need to collect these. We could walk around and just survive off the water we find until our specimen is grown. But the biggest issue with that strategy is eventually you will run out of water, and there's not a lot near the gates of Sanctuary. You cannot carry more than 100% water, so you may have to leave water behind, and it's too far for you to go back and get it later. So really the most important thing to get is the water efficiency systems. We get to walk around the desert at night, and aesthetically it just looks so cool, and eventually we find another small settlement more hidden into the mountains, with bodies lying around everywhere. Going up to the bodies gives us a chance to hear their last recorded thoughts, which is such a cool idea and something I would love to see in like a detective game. Only you can forgive yourself. May our pain be someone else's lesson. One explains it was drought raiders who got them and even tells us there's a full tank of water in the back, and another quotes a Simpsons reference. Eventually we come across this giant half-skeleton figure in the ground. We get some very small bits of lore in this game, and while the creator has implied that there may be more to the game than what we see on the surface, I think even if there isn't a lot more to the game, I think sometimes it's okay to just have a really cool aesthetic for a short game like this, and I super appreciate the effort that went into that. After more walking around and upgrades and a long stretch of not seeing any people, we come across the Scrapyard Haven. It's basically these large, flat hills with textures of scrap, and I wasn't sure if it was intended to be climbed around on or not. I found some water right away, which I assumed would be the point of this area, just a small detour to get some water, but I decided to continue exploring further, and that's when I discovered that there was in fact full damage in this game. Unfortunately, there was no chance for me to recover, as this drained almost all of my water instantly, and I was too far away from any new territory to know if there was even water to be found there. So we started again from the beginning, making our way through what we already had once, this time with more speed and less water pickups because I already knew where the big ones were. Without too much more extra time, we made it back to where we were, and while I'd still very much like to know if there is something beyond the walls of trash, I again didn't feel confident about my water levels, so I headed for the large fire off in the distance. I'm not sure if this large fire is supposed to be a reference to something or if it's supposed to be alluding to something. It almost feels like a bit of a Viking funeral kind of thing. But the only reason I say that there might be more to this area is because there's a rather distinct pattern to the tree branches that's on fire, so maybe there is something to it and maybe it's just an aesthetic choice. It's mostly barren outside of a few trees, but we did find some guys to kill for more water and a specimen growth pickup, meaning we had less than a quarter to go. So if I survived to get to the gates of Sanctuary, I was pretty confident we were going to make it. I encountered some deforested areas with some random skulls lying around, and while the land of this area was pretty flat and barren, it really made me appreciate the sky and the landscape more often, especially as the day became night. It kind of gave me flashbacks to playing Knights of the Old Republic and how kind of repetitive some of the walking was there if you didn't have force speed. I tend to play a lot of games that contain long stretches of just walking and not doing much else, but I think I really have the proper mindset for it because I really enjoy atmospheres and environments and musical backgrounds. We walked through some large Skeletor looking statues, which leads us right back to the beginning, and by the time I was done exploring around, I noticed my specimen was full and my water was draining fast, so I decided to head back to the Sanctuary gates, which opened up for us. After they did, we got to experience the game's first and only cutscene. Sanctuary is actually a cemetery. Our character walks in holding a flower, the specimen that we've been growing. On top of the tombstone, a mask and helmet identical to ours. The last words of the game are, "I miss you, I am sorry." What I really enjoy about this story is how much is open to interpretation. We don't actually know if our character caused this person's death, whether directly or indirectly. We don't know if any of the characters speaking to us in hateful words actually hated us, or perhaps it was our mind's perception of how people must be thinking of us because of our guilt. We don't know how this person died, and thus it really leaves the ending open, possibly in an effort to allow you to relate to it in your own way through personal experiences. This could be a story of survivor's guilt, possibly surviving an accident when the other person did not, a story about not having seen the person often enough before their death, or perhaps the character is more directly involved, maybe the cause of the accident, or in the darkest timeline, intentionally ending the other person's life. The mind goes through a lot of steps and emotional processing when tragedy occurs, and to visualize it and represent it in such a way that makes it like a physical journey, I think is quite beautiful, and this definitely isn't the only game to do it, but I really enjoyed how this game did it. It also brings me back to the mechanic of not being able to save, and while I'm not sure if it was intended to be just a quirky little mechanic for the hour you'll play the game, I'd like to think of it more as a direct comparison to grief. Moments will happen in life where sometimes it feels like you have to restart in your grieving process, and some days will always be harder than others. However, as you start to go through it more, aka play the game more, you'll start to recognize the beginning of that process and learn how to handle it better. In one of the top Steam reviews, someone suggests that perhaps the game needed more mechanics like a store to buy and sell things, or being able to fast travel back to the town, more upgrades or skill trees. And I don't mean to sound rude, but I just don't know if this person understood the point of this game. I'm not sure this was intended to be a fully fleshed out experience. I think it was intentionally left very accessible and easy to play so that the player could focus more on the story elements of the last few seconds of the game. I do agree with their final point, however, that most people playing this game will probably be asking for more, and whether we'll see this gameplay mechanic expanded on or not is not for any of us to decide. While I really enjoyed my hour playing and I definitely want to see more, I also understand that sometimes people want to let things be good and move on to the next. Not everything needs a sequel. Perhaps this game told the story that the creator wanted it to tell. It's this great little story that combines gameplay with a simple yet extremely relatable story, a reminder for all of us to keep going and to carry on, but that there will be hard days in between. And carry on I shall, and carry on we shall. My name is Ghostboy259, and I'm simply here to remind you that grief and guilt are journeys, oftentimes with no end in sight or any clear destination. And it's important to remember that everyone deals with it in very different ways. For some people, a very few people, they can get all of their emotions out in a short amount of time and then begin to pick up the pieces. And for the rest of us, it comes in waves. Thanks for watching.